I finally got one. I finally got a RunCam Thumb Pro. I waited so long to get this. I am so excited to open it. I think I might have ordered the wrong thing. Hey everybody, I'm Bacon Ninja, and today we're going to talk about the RunCam Thumb Pro. Now maybe you don't know what the RunCam Thumb Pro is. Maybe you live under a rock and you never heard about the first RunCam Thumb. Well, let me just quickly tell you what the deal is. This is a super lightweight action camera from RunCam. It's the second in the line of super lightweight action cameras from RunCam. The difference with this one is that it is 4K. And there's a couple other small differences. But before we get into a quick rundown of exactly what this camera is, what we're going to be doing today is exploring all of the ways that we can get the most out of this little bitty 17 gram, $90 4K action cam that you can put on nearly any quad. 3.5 inch quad? Sure. 3 inch quad? Sure. Maybe even 2.5 or 2s, or if you want to get really brave, your tiny whoops. They might not fly great with 17 extra grams, but they could probably carry it, which is more than can be said for things like the Insta360 Go 2 or the Caddx Peanut, and definitely more than can be said for things like the bigger brother of the RunCam Thumb, the RunCam 5 Orange, which is a camera that I personally love and have done a pretty extensive video on how to make it look its best. We're going to do that today with this camera. But for those of you that have been living under a rock and have never heard of this, it's been out for a little bit now. I'm very surprised. I'm not going to hold it against you though. Under a rock actually sounds pretty nice sometimes. Maybe I'll try it someday. But first, let's go over a short list of bullet point specs and features about the RunCam Thumb Pro. The RunCam Thumb Pro is a $90 17 gram 4K action camera, which is pretty insane. And when you open it up, you're going to find things like the camera itself, as well as this cabling harness that allows you to have UART control from your flight controller, as well as power the camera via your flight controller's 5-volt rail. And the camera supports GyroFlow. It comes with a few mounts in the box. It supports SD cards up to 256 gigs. Unlike the original Thumb, it has twist lock ND filters, so you won't lose them in a crash. And it shoots in up to 4K at 30 FPS, which is a whole lot in a very small package for $90. The original Thumb costs less. It costs around 60 bucks, but it only shoots in 1080p. It does weigh a little less than the Thumb Pro. It doesn't have this weird jutting outness of the front of the sensor, but it is not as good a camera. This is a 4K camera. But don't let it fool you. There are some bad things about this. And because we're going to talk about how to make the best of this camera in this video, we're going to talk about things like the best way to power the camera and move it from quad to quad, ways to use this as a USB webcam or to preview your footage on your phone before you start shooting, how to color grade it, make it look better, and all the settings you need to use. So we are going to talk about how to make it good, but that means that it's not good to start with. And it's not that it's bad. The footage looks like this straight out of the camera. And it's not terrible, but there's a lot to be desired. And the reason for that is that cheap cameras use cheap sensors, and cheap sensors mean things like low depth of color, low dynamic range, low effective pixels. There's some really critical things that don't happen to save money in cheap cameras, and this is one of them. So keep that in mind. This is not the world's best camera. It will not replace your GoPro. It will not replace your RunCam 5 Orange 4K, but it will fit on your micros. And honestly, I took this out and played with it on a full 5 inch. And it did a really good job, I think, for the cost. There's just some things you need to consider. When you buy a cheap camera, you have to consider that you're going to be doing extra work to make up for the cheapness. And this camera is no different from that. So let's jump right into some of the best things you can do to make the most out of this $90 camera. And the first one we're going to talk about is updating the firmware. That sounds like a no-brainer, right? But some people have a really hard time updating the firmware on this camera. It's actually a very straightforward process. It starts by going to RunCam's website, where you download a zip file containing the firmware. Once you have the zip file, you open it from where you downloaded it. You take one of the files out of the zip file and put it on the root of your SD card. You eject your SD card from the computer. Then you take your SD card and put it in the camera. Once you power the camera up, it's gonna start up and show a blinking series of red and green lights. It's gonna do that for a little while. And then when it's done, it's gonna power down. Once it's powered down, you're good to go. The firmware is updated. Now, updating the firmware is a prerequisite to some of the things we're going to be doing in the rest of this video, like shooting in 4K 30 FPS and using it as a USB webcam or monitoring the live feed over USB so you can check your exposure and other things when we talk about the best settings you can use with this camera. So updating the firmware is the first thing. If you haven't ever done that, start there. You want to support gyroflow, 4K, and live view, you need to update the firmware. So if you haven't, definitely go do that. Now let's talk about the second thing you should do to make the most of this camera. And that is powering it with something that you can move between quads. And in order to do that, we're going to use a cable by iFlight, which has nothing to do with RunCam or anything to do with this camera. Actually, it's made for a GoPro. But what it is it's a 5-volt BEC that runs on 4 to 6S from the balance plug. It comes out as just a red and black hot and ground connection. And if you take that cable and you cut it and then you solder on the RunCam Thumb Pro's in for powering, you have a cable which you can move around from quad to quad. Now, remember I said at the beginning of this step that it is only 4 to 6S. So it won't work on a 2S or a 3S quad. That's unfortunate, but I want to say that a lot of times you're going to be using this camera on maybe a 3.5 inch or a 3 inch that runs a 4S pack. Heck, there are even some 3 inches and under that run 4S packs now. So if you're running a 4S pack or a 6S pack, if you're putting it on a full-size quad or a bigger quad that runs 6S packs, this is the perfect solution because you can just take it from quad to quad. If you don't have a 4 or 6S pack and you're gonna be using some other kind of power to power it, that means you're gonna need a lot of the power leads. So just go ahead and stock up on those because you're gonna be putting one on the 5-volt rail of each quad you want to use this camera with. Now I'm very used to that. I fly the GoPro Hero Bones, which is the same way. I have a lead on each of my quads that goes to VBAT, and that's how I power my camera. So I'm used to it, but if you're used to flying something like the Go 2 or something with an internal battery, you're just gonna have to figure this out. And the best way to do it if you're flying 4 and 6S is with this iFlight cable. So just pick one of those up, cut it, solder it together, and prosper. It's way easier than soldering a cable to each of your 5-volt rails. And now that you got the thing powered, let's talk about the third thing you should be doing to get the most out of this camera. And that is using the correct SD cards. So I mentioned it will utilize an SD card up to 256 gigabytes, and that is true. And at 4K, you're gonna be recording roughly about a gig a minute at 4K 30. So that's a lot of time, 256 gigs. But not just any 256 gig card is gonna cut it with this camera because it does have a reasonably high bit rate. When I've exported some of these over to my editing software, Premiere Pro, I took a look at some of the bit rates and I'm seeing bit rates up above 100 megabits per second. Sometimes 115. It is an adaptive bit rate, but it's pretty high for a really cheap $90 camera. I would expect to see something like an 80 megabits per second bit rate out of this thing. I'm seeing 115 in some cases. And in order to record that without having any hiccups in your footage or losing frames, which is a big complaint about this camera people have, is losing frames, you really need to use a good quality SD card that can handle that much writing in a stream continuously for however long you want to record. Especially because it's not going to run out of battery, it's plugged into your quad. So it's just going to keep on going forever until the SD card's full or you stop it. So make sure you get a card with this symbol on it. It is a U with a 3 in there. That means it is a class 3 card, and that card is rated for high enough write speeds to allow you to write the 120 potentially bits per second that are coming out of this camera without frame stutters. If you don't do that and you go for something cheap, you might get away with it. If you want to run this camera at something like 1080p, you'll probably get away with just a regular class 1 card, but you need a class 3 card if you're going to be running 4K 30. That's a very important thing. Don't run out and buy just the cheapest card Walmart has. Spend a couple more bucks and get the class 3. In fact, I went and looked, and the cheap Walmart brand, the On brand, was the same price as the SanDisk for the class. So you're not really saving any money. Just go buy the good one. Stop cheaping out. This isn't the place to do it. You already did that on the camera. Get a decent card. And that brings me to the fourth thing you should be doing to get the most out of this camera. Which is previewing the camera via live preview. Wait a minute. This is a RunCam camera, right? If you haven't ever used RunCam cameras, that means that you program this thing with QR codes. You normally go through all the settings and you generate a QR code, and then you point the camera at it and it takes those settings. It saves it to the SD card, and then it just kind of sets itself up from the QR code. There's not a way to connect via Wi-Fi or Bluetooth to this camera. It doesn't have it. So what do I mean by live preview? I mean via USB, because you can actually activate a mode where this camera becomes a USB camera. And not only can you do it on your computer, you can do it on your phone. If you're running an Android phone and you have OTG or a built-in host mode in your Android phone, most of us have that nowadays, you can download an app from the App Store called USB Camera, and I will put a link to it in the description. You download that. It's a little confusing, and yes, it's ad supported, but once you get it set up for the first time, you essentially just plug the camera in, it will power itself from your phone, you click the button once, and it enables USB video mode. And that video mode is using the same settings as your shooting settings. So you can preview things like exposure, white balance, make sure your ND filter isn't too strong or too weak, all from your phone in the field. Now, if you have an iPhone, just forget about it. I do not think it will work with an iPhone. That is the price you pay for owning an iPhone. Great cameras, great hardware, not open source software. So they don't really allow apps like this in the App Store. It has some decent reviews. I can't tell you anything about the manufacturer. I do know that I wouldn't leave it on all the time because it'll probably eat your battery. But when you're using it, you can absolutely preview your Thumb Pro via USB with your phone, which is really handy for those days where you're not quite sure if you need an ND16 or an ND32, or if your white balance is set correctly. And all of those things lead me to my next point, which is the fifth thing you should be doing to get the most out of this camera. And that is color grading the footage. This is a cheap camera. The effective resolution is not 4K, and the color depth is not terrific. And what do I mean by the effective resolution is not 4K? Well, we have a sensor inside the camera, and although we are set to record in 4K, that doesn't mean that I have enough pixels in my sensor to actually export a native 4K video. And RunCam is pretty notorious for this. They did the exact same thing on the RunCam 5 Orange. Its default 4K mode essentially takes the 4x3 sensor, chops the top and the bottom off of it, and gives you a 16:9 chunk out of the middle. The RunCam Thumb Pro is no different. You basically get a middle section of the sensor. It's not the best, but it is what we have. I'm hoping that someday, just like they did with the RunCam 5 Orange, they will put the 4K XV mode, which actually takes the whole sensor and then does a weird stretch thing. And in my video about how to get the best look out of the RunCam 5 Orange, I actually stretched that and did some things to make it appear to have a GoPro Super View look. You can't really do that with the Thumb Pro. I spent a lot of time fiddling with it, and I did actually get it to work a little bit. I had some dynamic stretching and it corrected a little bit of the lens distortion, but it still looked funny. So don't get down that rabbit hole. Just use the footage as it comes out of the camera with the middle of the sensor as your 16:9. But in order to get the most out of that picture, you really ought to color grade it. And in order to color grade it, there are some settings considerations that you should keep in mind. So here are the settings that I am using for my Thumb Pro. The video quality is high. I don't care about loop recording, don't use the loop recording. I've set the resolution to 4K 30, volume FPV, which takes the volume down a little bit. I am using a 1/60 shutter because I am shooting at 30 FPS, ISO sensitivity to 100 in the flat color profile. Now those are the basic settings you're gonna want out of the standard settings page. There is another page under the general section though, and in there I am setting things like my saturation, contrast, sharpness, metering modes, and white balance. Now, as far as the saturation, contrast, and sharpness, that's really up to you as a pilot preference. I like to have them low. I don't like oversaturated images. I'd rather do color grading if I want saturation. I don't like sharpness in camera because you can't take it out, but you can add it in. So if I want sharpness in post, I'll put sharpness in there. As far as the white balance goes, there's no color temperature range. This is a cheap camera. It's configured with a QR code. There's not going to be a color temperature range. It is nice that you can preview it via USB if you're using tip number 4, but I recommend you just go with Sunny because the white balance is just kind of a little off anyway. Sunny tends to be the most average looking, half decent one that you can get for outdoor shooting. If you're doing something indoors, you might consider something else and just use the USB preview function to see if it works, because you can. If you have an Android phone, again, if you have an iPhone, just, I'm sorry. Number 4 is total bummer for you. And once you have all those settings set, you just generate your QR code, turn your camera on, double click the button, point the camera at it, it will configure itself and the light will go from green to red, and then you know you're ready to go record. That's all there is to getting the settings done. But once you get home with that footage, you still have to color grade it. And how are you going to color grade RunCam Pro footage? Are you going to sit at your computer and manually manipulate the colors? If you're buying a $90 action camera, there's a really good likelihood that you're not the person generating color grades. And I'm not going to dog you for that. There's really not a lot of reason to go through the hassle of creating a color grade for the Thumb Pro. But I'll tell you what does work. The Johnny FPV LUTs for GoPro. They're actually made for more than GoPro. What Johnny's doing is taking a Rec 709. If you don't know what that is, it's a color spectrum standard. It's a color space standard. He's taking a Rec 709 LUT. So he's taking your GoPro footage, applying a Rec 709 LUT to get it in a standard color range, and then he's applying the GoPro LUTs on top of it. Now, why can't we do that with the Thumb? We sure can, but someone needs to make a Rec 709 color space technical LUT. Who would that someone be? I did, and I'm going to give it to you for free. I already made the LUT. The .cube file is in the link below in my Google Drive. Just go download it and use it. And real quickly, just let me show you how to apply the technical LUT and then how to apply the Johnny LUT for reference if you've never done this before. And there will also be a link to the Johnny LUTs down below. If you do use them, ignore what he tells you in the documentation on how to use it, because it's going to be different when you're using it for the Thumb. Just go with what I'm going to show you for how to apply it to the Thumb Pro footage. So here's how to apply the technical LUT and then throw a Johnny LUT on top. And I'll show you what some of the sliders do for you and which ones you should look out for with the Thumb Pro. All right, so I'm at the computer and I have Premiere Pro up. Now I'm going to show you this in Premiere Pro because it's the editing software that I use. There's probably a different process for like DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut. I can't help you there. I don't know anything about DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut. What I can tell you is that some of the terminology should still apply. So if you can figure out how the terminology applies to your software, most likely the process is very similar. But I'll show you in Premiere Pro. For those of you using Premiere Pro, it's gonna be really easy because the instructions will just work. So let's jump into that. I've actually got a clip on the timeline, and you can see this clip on the timeline. I have the video up top, is not color graded. This is the flat color out of the RunCam Thumb Pro. And the first thing we're gonna do to color grade it is actually put an overlay on top. So we're gonna put an adjustment layer. If we right click on the Project Explorer here, new item, adjustment layer, we just let it be the video size because that conforms with what our timeline already is. And then we pull the adjustment layer over and we extend it across the entire clip. So we haven't made any adjustments to the clip, we just essentially put this layer on top. And this layer is where we're going to be doing our color grading. So I'm going to find an area in the video like this where we have some sky, we have some ground, and we have a little reference for our colors so that I can see how the grade's going to work. And the first step is to go to your Lumetri color tab over here. And in the first section under basic correction, the input LUT. That is where the technical LUT goes. So this is the LUT that I made for the RunCam Thumb Pro, and that will be the Rec 709 LUT for that. And I keep it in here, Thumb Pro Rec 709.cube. That's where you're gonna wanna apply it, is in the input LUT under basic correction. Once you've applied that, you can mess with some of these sliders. Sometimes you wanna mess with the color temperature. You'll notice that it gets a little orange if I go to the right and a little blue if I go to the left. I like to bring it down just a little bit. This was with an ND16 on a fairly sunny day, so I think right about there, where the whites look white and the blues don't look too blue and we still see some greens, is where we want to be. Now we can mess with things like exposure, contrast, and highlights. For most of the footage, the exposure is fine. You can mess with some of the contrast. I like to bring the contrast down a little bit. I like to bring the highlights down a little bit, but before I do that, I'm actually going to take the whites and bring them down, because sometimes that works a little better. You bring the whites down, bring the highlights back up just a hair. The shadows, that depends on daylight. So if it was really light out, really light outside, I would bring the shadows down, but see how that makes it too dark? I'm actually going to just bring them up a hair over center. So see how I can see everything? I have decent depth in the clouds, I can see my trees, I can see the depths in the grass there. That's all about what we want. So now it's time to actually apply the creative LUT, the thing that's going to do all the work and make this footage look good. And we're going to do that under the creative section of Lumetri Color in Premiere Pro. And in the creative section here, you'll see we have the look pull down. So in the look pull down, we go to browse, and this is where our Johnny LUTs actually come into play. So I keep my Johnny LUTs in here. Johnny LUTs for GoPro, FPV LUTs. So you see the GoPro conversions. These are the things that turn your GoPro into Rec 709. We're not gonna mess with that. We're gonna go to the quick fix. And there are some options in quick fix, and inside of each one of these options, there are more options. Less exposure for if it's too bright, less exposure for if it's too bright, but you still want to keep the shadows a little bit brighter, and more exposure for if it was too dark. Inside of Cine, though, you only have 3 options, and I actually think the Cine Pop looks pretty good on here. Now you'll see that made everything kind of overly dark. We can go over here and adjust the intensity slider, so that is all the way off. This is partly on. I think somewhere between 50 and 70% is pretty good. Now sometimes you might go a little high. You know, I'm up to like almost 70, and then I can go back to my basic correction and make a couple of adjustments if I want to use that much color. I can also turn the saturation down from here. So just a hair under on the saturation. It looks good. We can go back, and I think the intensity is good. Now we can add some sharpness, which is hard to see on this little screen. But because we didn't put sharpness in the settings as the footage was recorded, this is where you'll add your sharpness in post to get any sharpness back. If you overdo the sharpness, you're gonna get that weird digital shimmer. So don't overdo it. Just go till it looks pretty good to your eye, to your taste. And then play it a little bit and make sure it still looks good while it's moving. And then you can go up with the vibrance a little. You can see what that kind of does. It's almost like saturation, except for it only works toward a few colors. I like it just a little bit over middle. And then we have another saturation slider, and this thing will really go to town, right? So you can desaturate all the way to black and white or oversaturate all the way to crazy. I actually think it's pretty good in the middle there. So this is about where I would have the color grade. I put my technical LUT that I created in the input LUT. I messed with a few things in my basic correction. Went to the creative tab, changed the look to Cine Pop. You could also change it to any of these other ones. Let's see, like future, we'll do less exposure. And you notice there's more than one in here. The further down you go, the less additional exposure it's adding. But you can see that I can actually get a whole different look by using a different LUT on here. That one's probably a little too bright, actually. Let me pull that down. I think we might be in like future 2 or 1. It's about the right brightness. Maybe not. We'll just try them all. Try everything until you get something you like. There we go. And then if we apply that LUT a little harder, back to basic correction, maybe resaturate it a tad, there's a whole different look for our footage. I can bring the highlights down a little if I want, make the blacks look blacker, which kind of brings the darkness down. So there's a whole different look for the footage just by changing the creative LUT out, and I never messed with a technical LUT at all. So not too hard. And look what the results are here. If we play the video, you can see I have a pretty decent color in here. It's really not too bad at all. Now let me just turn that off for you. And that's the difference that we made by applying these LUTs. It's pretty marked difference here between no LUT and LUT. And that's all there is to it. If you have Premiere Pro, use those steps. Johnny's instructions, like I said, are not this, so just go with this method. And if you really haven't messed with color grading in post, just mess with the sliders until you get something you like and start to understand what the sliders are. It's not going to be perfect at first, but then you start to learn what each of them do and how they affect the footage. Over time, you learn how to color grade, but don't be afraid to do it. The RunCam Thumb Pro is a perfect platform to learn how to color grade on because it'll only let you go so far before it looks really screwed up. So yeah, it's pretty quick feedback. But to summarize all this, let me show you some footage of me flying the Thumb Pro for the first time with my 5-inch quad, and I'm gonna kind of go between the factory flat export and my color graded export, and you'll see some indicators of that. So here is a short edit of me flying the Thumb Pro with a full-size 5-inch freestyle quad. Enjoy.
I've been in my feels again. It's keeping me awake again. Thinking about what we said. It cuts just like a knife, but it's colder now outside. Said I'd take a slow to clear my head of memories we like. And I know you don't think about me anymore. I've been in my feels again. Just thinking about all I said. Pulling from wandering the streets till I can catch my breath. Wrote you back but I don't sing, just left unread. But it's colder now outside. Said I'd take it slow to clear my head of memories we like. And I know you don't think about me anymore. I've been in my feels again, and I can't accept what's done. Yeah, we both moved on, and I don't know how we got this way, but you promised me that we would be.
And now that I have finally run out of things to talk about when it comes to the Thumb Pro, I'm gonna wrap up the video. I'm gonna give you one more tip. Don't use the UART control to start and stop the camera. Yes, you can do it, and if you know Betaflight CLI or can read through the documentation that RunCam provides, it's fairly easy to get set up. You just solder it to a UART, you go do some pin-IO box stuff, you set it to a channel on your radio, and you can start and stop the camera from your radio. That's really cool. Until you accidentally stop it when you meant to start it, or you accidentally start it when you meant to stop it, or you forget to do it altogether and it gives you no auditory indication of it being done, and then you go fly and nothing's recording. Because pin-IO box is just a momentary click. It's not an on-off switch. Now you could set some logic to on-off switch to momentary inside your radio, but are you gonna really, you can dig that deep, or are you just gonna put it on a momentary switch and just press the thing? You're just gonna do that. And that means you're gonna take off with the quad and it's not gonna be recording. So just pick the quad up, press the button, validate with the blinky light that it is recording, put it back down and fly. It's that simple. The only time when it comes in handy is when you get stuck in a tree or something and you wanna stop the recording. Okay, I get it then, but it's not worth the hassle and all of the trouble it could potentially cause. So that's my last tip. It's my unofficial number 6. Don't use the UART control to start and stop the camera. And now that I really have run out of things to talk about, I just want to say, all in all, this is the best camera you can get in the price range, in the weight class, on the market today. Other cameras like the Insta360 Go 2 have an internal battery, they weigh more. They have a limit to how much they can record. You can't swap SD cards, and it's much smaller than 256 gigs. They have a time limit to how much you can record based on that battery. You can record as long as your quad is running with this camera. And if you destroy it, you're not out a $300 camera. Who cares? I mean, you might care, but it's not nearly as bad as destroying a nice camera. So get this if you want to put some footage together of your micro fleet, or if you want to bash with a 5-inch and not care about the camera. And don't have high hopes for the quality of the video, because it's never going to have great color depth and it's never going to have great dynamic range, and the effective pixels just aren't always going to be what you're looking for. But if those aren't things that matter to you, or you don't have any idea what they mean, they're a perfectly fine camera. Go pick it up. Highly recommend it. In fact, I'm going to put a link to it at Race Day Quads because they're one of my favorite stores. It's not an affiliate link. I make no money on it. I just want you to be able to get it. They tend to have it in stock. So if you want it, go check it out there. And like I said before, if it's been helpful, give me a like, subscribe if you haven't, I'd really appreciate it. And until next time, stay greasy. I'll catch you later. Okay. You thought I was gone, but I'm actually back because it's time to shame the patrons. I have made a deal with these devils that I would Photoshop their names on top of bacon, on top of some kind of scene, every time I do one of these long format videos. It was a terrible, terrible idea, but I've already agreed to it, and I don't intend to back out now. So yet again, I have Photoshopped them in a scene as bacon strips with their name on top. And in order to shame them, I'm going to read them in a reverberated way, which makes it sound kind of weird, because why just say them normally? That just sounds boring. So anyway, it's time to do that. These people pay me money every month, and it's time to get what's theirs. Here's what's theirs.
Ohm FPV, Free Range Chicken RC, Crash and Burn FPV, Dylan H, TS13 FPV, Chad FPV, Logan R, Sweet Willie.
But seriously, thank you so much if you're one of the patrons whose names I just read. I could not do this without you. I really couldn't. I could not run this channel, support this channel, or have the motivation to keep making these really long, stupid videos if it wasn't for your encouragement, feedback, and kindness. So thank you so much. And if you're not a patron, but you want your name on the bacon strip, maybe you want to be a patron, I have my links down below in the description. But if you aren't a patron, thank you anyway. Thanks for watching this far to the end. You might be mentally unstable for not closing the video before this started. But I'm sorry for your psychiatry bills. It's not going to get any better. Anyway, that's all I have. I'm actually done now. So yeah, until next time, stay greasy, and I'll catch you later.